Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Masonic Cancer Centre seminar series. It's great to see you here in person and online. Rebecca Pratt, I'm the Co-Associate Director of Community Outreach and Engagement. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker today. Dr. Shalini Kulasingam comes to us from our very own Division of Epidemiology and Community Health in the School of Public Health, where she is a professor. Dr. Kulasingam has a long-standing career in HPV-related research, covering a range of things, including vaccination, cervical cancer, other HPV-related cancers, screening and cost-effectiveness modelling. Dr. Kulasingam was also recently honoured with the Sarah Evans Faculty Scholar and Leadership Award for her innovative and revolutionary work to prevent cervical cancer across the world. So I'm very excited and looking forward to this talk today. So welcome, Dr. Kulasingam, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk, Can We Eliminate Cervical Cancer?
Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. Lovely to see you all. Let's see. So this just gives you a brief outline. What I'm first going to do is give you a very quick primer on the natural history of HPV and cervical cancer, just so that as I go through with the terms that I use, they're familiar to you. Then I want to talk about screening and bring you up to date on some of the changes that have been made more recently and some of the changes that I anticipate coming down the road. Then talk about vaccination, and within the concept of vaccination, talk about this notion or this big push that we are currently engaged in around elimination. And then finish up with talking about screening in the era of vaccination. So with that, this just gives you an overview of the natural history of HPV infection and cervical cancer. HPV infection is the most common STI in the world. The lifetime risk, if you have sex, we basically say you're going to get HPV because the lifetime risk is upwards of 80%. It's acquired right after the onset of sexual activity, and by that I mean vaginal intercourse. And by the mid-20s, most Americans, I think 95%, report having engaged in sex. Most women clear their infection, however, some don't. And so what you see is this progression, and that progression is really aligned with a smaller group of women who are unable to clear their infection. And so what happens is they go from infected to precancer, and the precancerous lesion that you see there, we further classify that into what we call cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, grades 1 to 3. The most important of those is grade 3. That means that all of the epithelium has been infected. We consider that a surrogate for cancer. So that's the lesion when we're talking about screening that we want to detect and treat. And if left untreated, that has a risk of progression to cancer. This is the etiologic contribution of HPV genotypes. There are about 15 HPV types that are considered carcinogenic, that infect the genital tract. And of those, 16 and 18 account for approximately 70% of cervical cancers worldwide. The other types contribute to cancer, but they vary between populations. And so this was clearly a consideration for the Merck vaccines and the GSK vaccines when they were being formulated. So just to give you a sense of how far we've come, these are our cervical cancer death rates in the 1930s in the US. These are age standardized, but you can see that the crude rate was about 25 per 100,000. These are the raw numbers. And then based on standardized populations, right, about 34.4. In contrast, let's look at breast cancer, right? Somewhat similar numbers and age standardized rates as well. So these are the 1930s. All right. So let's talk about the role of screening. So for those of you who are females and have a cervix, you probably know about the pap smear. And I think we're coming up on like the 100th anniversary. And so in the 1920s, George Papanicolaou from Greece, was a physician who actually came up with this really simple test. Take a sample of the cells from the cervix, place them on a slide, use a stain, send it off to the lab, and then use that to basically see which of those cells are abnormal. And that is the test that we have been using for now, 100 years to actually detect cervical cancer. I should say that this test has been so successful and so simple to implement that I think we've been looking for something similar for the other cancers. I would say I don't feel like we've come close in terms of what we found with the Pap smear. We never had a trial. It was widely adopted in the US by the 1950s, 1960s, same with Europe by the 1970s. And you can see, though, this is ecologic data. Connecticut is our oldest cancer registry in our country. And you can see that, right, 0 indicates before screening, and you can see what has happened with our cancer rates. And so that's how we know that this has worked. I love this picture because it's so pretty, but it's actually an HPV virus, right? Just like, look at the colors. It can be so soothing and yet menacing. And so in the early 1980s, well, it depends on how old you are, but I'm old enough to think, well, that's not that long ago. Harald Zerhausen, a clinician in Germany, made the discovery around that HPV, which now consider a cause of cervical cancer. It's a necessary cause. Basically, you can't get cervical cancer unless you are infected with HPV, which stands for human papillomavirus. And so with this discovery, there has been a lot of work focused on detecting HPV instead of just taking those cells and creating Pap smears. And so this is just one page of a number of pages which shows you these FDA-approved tests. The point is now that we have a plethora of these tests. And this has become a consideration for our recommendation bodies in the US. So when we think about the benefits and harms of screening, the benefits are basically, right, if you screen, you prevent cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is, however, rare in our country, and so that is why I highlighted this notion of CIN3. So CIN3 has become the surrogate for cancer. And so what we look for when we're looking at any studies of screening, any trials that are done is the detection of CIN3. When we think of the harms of screening, though, it is not without its downsides. And so, right, anxiety, stigmatization. This is something that was of huge debate when we started testing for HPV, and clinicians having to deal with, well, where did I get it from? Who gave it to me? What do I have to say to my partner? Versus, right, you have some abnormal cells. And so that was kind of a shift change in how we had to deal with the fact that we now had this test that could test for the actual presence of the virus itself, but came with complications. Discomfort from additional diagnosis and treatment, bleeding from treatment. And then one of the things that has now become apparent is that when you're treating the cervix is the entrance to the womb. It's what maintains the integrity of the womb during pregnancy. Is that treating of the cervix for any precancerous lesions can, in fact, compromise the integrity of the cervix. And what that means is that we see an increased risk of, say, things like preterm delivery. And then the other thing is the number of colposcopic referrals. This is something that you might see in the literature as a way to kind of get a sense of the harms that are associated with screening. So as I mentioned, we have these different recommendation bodies. We have ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. We have the American Cancer Society. And then the one that I think is particularly salient is the United States Preventive Services Task Force. They make recommendations, and those recommendations are really used to inform reimbursement rates. And so when the task force looks at screening and makes their recommendations, They do this, they are constantly weighing what the value, right? The value of screening in terms of the benefits, which is this detection of cancer or CIN3, to the harms. And what you want to do clearly is make sure that the benefits of screening outweigh the harms. So this rather busy picture is something that we have moved towards in terms of thinking about how we integrate tests for cervical cancer screening. This is from a group at the NIH led by Mark Schiffman and Phil Castle. And what it is, so here's what was happening. In the early days when those HPV tests were coming out, the recommendation bodies like the Task Force and the American Cancer Society had to basically say, okay, now we have this new test. What are we going to do in terms of recommendations? How do we take that information and integrate it into our current recommendations? How do we change our recommendations? And as I showed you, there is a long and growing list of these tests that are being approved by the FDA. And so instead of having to meet each time and say, okay, now we have a new test, how does it work? How do we recommend it? How do we recommend using it? They stepped back from recommendations based on the actual test and started to look at management according to risk. So what does that mean? So if you give someone one of these tests and you know their test result, what you can do based on the EPI studies is say, what is their risk of a CIN3 after they have been tested? So if they're negative, what is their 3 and 5 year risk? And if they're positive, what is their 3 and 5 year risk? And then depending on where they fall, right, in terms of that risk, you can either say, look, their risk is really low enough that we can just send them back to routine screening. Their risk is intermediate, so let's do another test, or let's have them come in for colposcopy and biopsy. Or you can say, look, and clearly it's green versus red. Red, no, right? So bad, like, let's actually treat them either presumptively based on that test, or let's actually encourage them to come in for that next test and then get treated because their risk is high. So what that means then is, as long as you have a test that you can then categorize based on its result, you can then, right, based on the shading and agreed upon like threshold for this threshold is low enough, let's send them back to routine screening. This threshold is intermediate or high, then you don't have to deal with the actual test itself. You just have to know what is that post-test probability of having a CIN3. So given that then, what I wanted to show you was, this is work that was done early on. Well, early on is about, 10 years ago. And what this shows you is the risk of a CIN3 based on the test result. If you look at the very bottom, and you'll see that, right, the risk at 3 years after a normal test result is about 0.17%. And that's following a normal pap smear. This lower line tells you when, is that right? Yeah. The lower line tells you what that risk is for an HPV negative test. And what you see here is the risk that you get at 3 years with a normal pap is the same risk that you get at 5 years with a negative test. And so that's what was used to guide the decision to test every 5 years. If someone has a negative pap smear, a negative HPV test, that's why the recommendations are they come back every 5 years versus every 3 years with a pap test. Now, if you look over here, this is what happens if you have both tests, right? And you would think, well, if you have both tests, that's perfect. You get, right, even more information. Look at what that value is at for both tests at 5 years. It's a bit small, but it's 0.16% versus with your HPV test at 0.17% at the same time. So, So what this tells you is your pap smear is not doing a whole heck of a lot for you, right? It's really your HPV test, which is detecting and cleaning up, or like detecting, and as long as you treat all that disease, that's really what you're getting with co-testing. You're not really getting that much more bang for your buck. So in 2017, 2018, the task force went through another round of revisions. And here is, so when they do this, they have an evidence, they have a review of the evidence and a summary. And more recently, starting with 2012, and I worked on those recommendations, and now the group that I'm part of, we work with the task force and with the evidence practice centers to kind of, whenever they look at recommendations, to work with them doing modeling to kind of complement it. And so, but here was a task force summary in 2017. Both clinical trial evidence and modeling suggest that co-testing increases the number of follow-up tests by as much as twofold, but does not lead to increased detection of CIN3 compared with screening with high-risk HPV testing alone. So bottom line is it's looking at that data and saying, look, you have double the number of tests, but you're not getting that much more disease detected. So when they first came out with their recommendations, right? So the task force recommends screening every 3 years with PAPs, basically cytology alone. And then for age 30 to 65, screening with either PAPs every 3 years or screening with HPV every 5 years. Now, what you'll notice is, for any of you that have undergone screening recently are in the appropriate age group, co-testing is not there. Co-testing is testing with both. And so that was the draft recommendation that came out and was posted based on the science. And this is what happened. Pushback. So as you all know, we live in a political world. And so science does not always trump politics. And so with that pushback, here are the most recent guidelines. And you can see you can do co-testing every 5 years, or testing with HPV every 5 years, or cytology alone every 3 years. One other thing I want you to note here is note the age when we start screening. It's 21. And then at 65 years, it's no screening after adequate negative prior screening test results. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So I think that one of the things that is of interest, and I can see it probably going away maybe in the future, is co-testing. I think we will move to a point where we no longer recommend both and we just recommend either HPV testing. And I'm going to be interested too to see what happens with cytology. I know in other countries such as Australia, they've moved completely to HPV testing and they no longer use cytology at all. It has its pros and its cons, but this is just to kind of give you a sense of where we are currently with our screening recommendations. And so this is the task force, and this is what they recommend. And at this point in time, 2018, this was, these guidelines were consistent across the board. ACOG was also recommending it, as was the American Cancer Society. So in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, there was another change in the guidelines. I know, we were all of us were focused elsewhere. But here is what those guidelines are. So if you are to look at the prevalence of HPV infection, which is what this right-hand side, like it's on my left, but it's on your right-hand side. If you look at this figure over here, right? Soon after girls become sexually active, you can see, right, they get infected pretty quickly, highly transmissible, right? Peaks in the 20s and then goes down. So by the 30s, you see a much lower prevalence of HPV infection. And that, in fact, is what drives the recommendations that we test women with HPV beginning age 30 and older. The reason is that what you're going to get is a lot more false positives here, because disease really occurs like a few years after infection, so a couple of years afterwards. So you begin to see a rise in precancer around here, and then it just keeps going up for CIN3, and then women do clear it, but it's that smaller group that is going to have persistent HPV infection and then CIN3 that we really want to detect. And so for these evidence groups, what they wanted to do was, right, decrease the harms, which would be that you're getting a lot of tests that are positive but no actual underlying disease, and then increase the benefits. And so hence this decision around age 30 that you see in the guidelines. But the other thing is, right, with the adoption of HPV testing, what you saw from that difference in the risk after you've had a positive HPV test result versus if you have both cytology and HPV is the HPV test is great at detecting disease. And so there's been a lot of interest in, can we just switch to HPV testing? But if we do, what age would be the most appropriate age to recommend it? And so here is the Connecticut Cancer Registry information that I showed you. The lines are even lower now. This goes through the late 1980s. But the one thing to notice here is if you look at, so this is our cancer incidence rates. You'll notice that they don't start to tick up until the mid-20s. And so based on this and what we're seeing in terms of infection, in 2020, the American Cancer Society moved back and said, those aged cervical cancer screening should actually begin at age 25. You're not getting a whole lot of bang for your buck by screening before that. And then women aged 25 to 65 should have a primary HPV test every 5 years. And then if that's not available, do a co-test or a pap smear. So that's not consistent with the other recommendation bodies. And I think at some point, they're all going to have to look at this data and see whether they want to align themselves again or whether they're going to agree to disagree. So right now we have recommendations from one group that says age 21, and we have the American Cancer Society coming out with age 25. So what are some areas of continued research? One area that remains controversial is the age to end screening. This is a study that was just in the New York, or that was highlighted in the New York Times. It was looking at Medicare data. More than 1.3 million women over age 65 still receive screening and related services in 2019. 10% were over age 80, which is an especially low risk group, costing Medicare like close to $85 million per year. So these are women that are theoretically considered low risk. And the other thing I should say is we are unique from other countries. So other countries kind of have a hard stop at like age 65 or age 70, and they say, you know, you have one last test, and if that test is negative, we can exit you from screening. We differ from other countries in that we have either 3 consecutive negative normal test results if you have a PAP, or 2 consecutive negative co-tests within 10 years, and the last one being within the last 5 years. However, there's been this whole controversy around this because of this whole notion that when you look at SEER data, right, for any of you who are epidemiologists, your cancer incidence rate should be amongst those who are at risk of cervical cancer, who gets cancer. The problem with our cancer registry, with SEER registry, is it does not remove women who have hysterectomies. So once you actually remove that group, and we do a lot of hysterectomies in this country, and you can imagine that there is a growing group of women 60 years and older, like that group just continues to grow in terms of the number of women who have had hysterectomies. So those cancer rates are misleading, and they're actually higher than what we see in SEER. And so there was a paper that came out in 2014 by Ann Rosich and her group. Patty Gravitt is a senior author, basically saying, was the right decision made? And do we need to step back and rethink whether we should be exiting women at age 65, or do we need to reconsider and think about an older age to exit women? So that's an area that we're working on. More recently, I've been doing some modeling work with my colleagues. There's a group of us that are funded by the NCI, and there are 5 groups, but 4 of us in particular model. It's almost like you're doing an experiment, but you simulate what happens to the US population. We have these kind of enormous beasts that are these simulation models. And what we use them to do is, you can think of it like an experiment with 4 independent groups who have developed these 4 independent simulation models to look at what we predict with different kind of screening assumptions and vaccination assumptions. And so what we've been doing is looking at what do we predict in terms of cancer incidence and cancer deaths with the group that has theoretically met the criteria to exit screening. And so we're working on that and hoping to get that out soon. But again, this is one area that remains, I would say, contentious. The other area that I don't even know, I mean, I'm glad I'm not a clinician. This is one algorithm of, I think there's like 20 or 30 pages. And so if you have a woman that is undergoing cervical cancer screening, there's an app now that you download, and it's based on risk, but you can see that by age, by test result, and then the combination of pap smear result and HPV test and screening history, there are pages and pages of these algorithms for what you do with women. We call it like screening hell, basically. You enter some kind of loop which you never get out of. And so what this means is, we have these recommendations that are for women as a whole in our country, but I think at some point we are really, depending on how much data we can collect and where we're headed, I do think at some point we will probably get to personalized screening, because we're headed in that direction. All right. But the good news is, right, as I told you, in the 1930s, we had about as many breast cancer cases as we had cervical cancer cases. Look where we are now. Right, so screening has been extraordinarily effective for cervical cancer. But you see it for breast, and that's why I feel like we're continuing to look for a magic bullet similar to the pap smear, but we haven't found it for other cancers. And it's now no longer, it used to be a leading cause of cancer death for women. It is no longer the case. In fact, we consider it a rare cancer. And so a success story, to be sure. Okay, so what about what's going on locally? So these are the most recent data that I can find that I'm going to be showing you. But these are 2018 rates, and you can see that Minnesota, Wisconsin, right, the Dakotas, these are all, we have really low rates of cervical cancer. So our rates of cervical cancer are low compared to everyone else, like our surrounding regions here. And in fact, right, look at the numbers, right? 130 cancer cases were reported, and then in Wisconsin, 183. And then look at the adjusted rate, 6 per 100,000, and for Minnesota, it's 4.5 per 100,000. And that is something to note for a reason. So we have low absolute numbers, and our rates are low. But that's not to say we don't have disparities. And so Pap test screening is actually lowest for Asian groups compared to the other groups in our state. So this is MDH data. And in terms of deaths, what is it? So the incidence rates are actually highest for American Indians, but look at the mortality. Mortality rates are actually highest for Asians. And when we talk about Asians, what does that mean as a group? So this is the American Community Survey. And you can see that, you know, Asian is kind of, it's like Asian is, it's a huge continent, right? India, Laos, right? We have Hmong, the Hmong community, Vietnam, people from China, people from Thailand, also including the Hmong. So it's a very heterogeneous group in Minnesota, but it is a group that I think, you know, is one that warrants some attention. The thing is, we have had pap smears, right? And now HPV tests. As I mentioned, we've had pap smears for over 100 years. So why aren't women getting screened, and how do we address that? I think that is something that is tougher to address. And I say that as someone who is an epidemiologist and decision modeler. I take my hats off to people like Rebecca that work in the community and actually do the harder work of figuring out how to get women screened, because it's the behavior and that I think is tough, right? And so this just shows you some of the things that we deal with that have to be addressed when you're talking about screening, right? Challenges with, say, a new system, processes and protocols, whenever you upgrade your computer systems, how are you keeping track of women, right? We don't have a national cancer screening program like they do in Australia, different parts of Europe or the UK. And so how you keep track of women, how you remind them when they're going from one health system to another, or they change insurance, that's something that we constantly deal with, right? Then there are things like fear, reluctance, confusion. In the last 10 years, we have had multiple changes in our recommendations. And besides driving clinicians nuts, you know, just think about how simple it used to be. So it used to be that you said from 18 to, I think, age 70, you just come in every year for a pap. Every single year, that's what we were doing. But now it's become so complicated that I think keeping track of that and saying, is it 3 years? Is it 5 years, right? What was my test result? I mean, I keep mine in Excel spreadsheet because I'm like, I can't remember. When am I supposed to do something, right? Decreased primary care capacity. And then, right, some of the things that we are continuing to struggle with, inequities, right, within our systems and access to care, and where do you feel comfortable going for care? This is something that Rebecca can speak more clearly to than I, but one of the things that holds much promise is self-collected HPV tests. So the great thing about HPV is we now have tests that you can actually order on Amazon, although I should warn you, they're not, that's right? There are no FDA approved tests as of yet. So this is just, right? But you can basically order this test off Amazon, right? Self-collect it, send it in, and get your HPV test result. And in other countries such as Australia and the Netherlands, self-collected HPV tests are now part of their recommendations. So they give women the option to actually screen at home and just send in their test, as opposed to having to come into a clinic and be screened there. And so we're currently, I think the FDA is currently considering whether they want to approve these tests. There are a lot of, right? It's not just the collection itself. As you recall, as I mentioned, there are pages and pages of different HPV tests. So it's not just, right, what kind of collection device do you approve? And then what test do you approve it with? Because those combinations actually do make a big difference. The other thing though, and we have been discussing this, you know, with different recommendation groups, different groups that are doing screening around this. And again, Rebecca can speak to this because this is her area of expertise. But one of the things that I think is unique in unique to some degree, right? We have women that don't participate in screening for some reason. And those have to do with the characteristics probably of, right, their fear of going into a clinic, their fear of or some issue around interacting with the clinic, assuming that that is the hurdle versus the actual issue around collecting a test and maybe fear or embarrassment that goes with sampling, right? Issues around how women view their bodies. But there was a trial that was done in Washington State where non-responders, as we call them, were sent these self-collected tests. What we see is that women are find this a very acceptable way of being screened. The problem is they get an HPV test result, and then you're still back to the same issue, which is that they're reluctant to come back into the clinic. And so it's that whole process, right? Because we need them not only to be screened, but then to be treated in order for it to be successfully addressed. And so I think there's clearly excitement around this, but I think that additional hurdle of how do we still address the fears that go with getting women into the clinic and then treated is where I think some of the work still needs to be done. All right, so we've talked about screening. What about vaccination? So as I mentioned, right, these are the HPV types that contribute to cervical cancer. You can see 16 and 18, and then we get the others, 45, 31, right, 33. I should update the X. I'm sure we know what the X is by now, but so this is worldwide. So the first vaccines that were formulated were 16 and 18. They targeted 70% of cervical cancers worldwide. Now we have more, I think, that are included. I think 7 that are included, oncogenic types that are targeted by the nonavalent vaccine. It is the vaccine that is now recommended and used across the US for our kids. So, and it's been approved since 2006. And I think boys, right, so it's first girls only, and then boys were approved in 2012, I think. So in addition to screening, we now have vaccines to prevent infection. And in fact, these vaccines are now licensed up to age 45, but I think from 25 to 45, it's a discussion with your clinician as to whether you will benefit. Because the truth of the matter is you really get your bang for your buck when you vaccinate kids before they become sexually active. I mean, the evidence is pretty limited about the benefit after you've been vaccinated, as long as you've not been infected with one of those types that are included in the nonavalent vaccine. So with that then, this is a statement that came out in 2020. Yep, pandemic years. So this was the American Cancer Society and the National Cancer Institute. So the American Cancer Society came out with this announcement, and the Masonic Cancer Center was part of the other NCI. So there's a group of NCI-funded cancer centers around the country. We signed on to this agreement, and so we supported this announcement when it came out, which is a statement on cervical cancer elimination. So we have different types of screening tests that are highly successful, and now we have vaccines. And so the statement that was this: elimination is defined, and I'll update that, reduction to 0 cases or near 0 in a defined geographic area. Vaccines have had great success in eliminating diseases such as polio and in many regions, measles. Never in history has a cancer been eliminated, but ACS believes that the elimination of cervical cancer is a very real possibility if 2 conditions are met. We need, and the key here is sustained high vaccination coverage for preteen boys and girls, and continued screening and treatment. Screening is not enough, right, for cervical cancer, for cervical precancers. They set a goal of 93% by this was in 2020. It's not really, and I'll talk about what's happened since then. So those were the goals, and so I should say NCI, right? And then these other international bodies, including WHO, has signed on for this. And so, and when we talk about elimination, realistically, what we're talking about is reducing incidence to below 4 per 100,000. So if you remember, Wisconsin was at 6 per 100,000, and we were at 4.5, 4.5 per 100,000. So close. So with that, one of the considerations is why both girls and boys. So this is the incidence of cervical cancer in Minnesota, and as you can see, it has decreased dramatically. Wisconsin is more interesting to me. I mean, Minnesota is interesting, but Wisconsin is also interesting. I mean, you see this kind of, it just keeps forwarding, this downward trend, but it kind of jumps around a bit. And the mortality has decreased somewhat, but it's staying, right? Staying pretty flat. But it's interesting to me that this is a state right next door and kind of what some of those issues are that are unique to Wisconsin compared to Minnesota. So we've talked about HPV in relation to cervical cancer, but here are some of the other considerations. So every year in the US, about 14,000 oropharyngeal cancers related to HPV infection. 6,500 anal cancers, about 90% of anal cancers are caused by infection with HPV, right? Vulvar and vaginal cancers and penile cancers. There are no screening tests that are recommended for these. So really what you have is vaccination. And this is why the push to vaccinate boys in addition to girls. And this is more evidence for why. So HPV related cancers, right? So in women, there are about 2,000, like 1,800 cases, or about 360 per year. The incidence rate for HPV-related cancers was 11.5. In men, though, look at this, 9.3. So while cancer rates have went down, they've begun to rise again. And here's why. It's mouth and oral cancers. So while we've done a great job with cervical cancer, we are still dealing with oral cancers. And so that's something that I think we need to, so that's why we have to start pushing on this. And the other thing is that, so these are the number of cancers we could prevent if we could target them with the vaccines that we have currently available. Wait, and did I? And then these are HPV-associated cancers for by gender. And what we're seeing is that cervical cancer, right, oropharyngeal cancer, but look at oropharyngeal cancer in males, that last part there. So it's increasing, and it's a bigger burden in males than in females. So the most common HPV-related cancer in Wisconsin is oropharyngeal cancer, which is twice as common in men than in women. So this is why when we talk about HPV vaccine, I think everyone thinks about cervical cancer, but they need to be thinking about these other cancers as well, and why we need to be vaccinating our boys in addition to our girls. So what we need, though, is to achieve high vaccination coverage, right? And personally speaking, this is just my own opinion, I think that on-time vaccination of kids before they become sexually active is where we're going to get our most bang for our buck. This is Minnesota, which prides itself on being above average. These are our adolescent vaccines, so look at this. So close to 90%, if not a little higher than the national average for meningococcal and Tdap. Look at HPV vaccination, though, lower, and look at how it is for up to date. So this is our 2021 data. So we have work to do here. And sorry about this, this is not as clear, but the rates are actually lower for meningococcus and for HPV, very similar to what we have. And in fact, what is it? It's around 30 to 40% for completion for up to date. So again, we're doing a great job with the other adolescent vaccines, but not as good of a job with HPV vaccination. And I did just want to show you this slide. This shows you that right? As with most things, right, those overall rates for our state obscures what's going on. I mean, for a state obscures what's going on locally. This is by county, and what you can see is there are counties in Wisconsin where actual uptake is less than 55%. I don't have similar data for Minnesota, but when we last had this data for Minnesota, we had some states, and I think it was 2018, where we had some counties where the uptake was less than 20%. So we absolutely have work to do in Minnesota. And these are just up to date, even lower compared to just having had one shot. And then along came the pandemic, right? Of all the vaccines, HPV vaccination basically fell off completely and utterly. This is the most recent data with vaccination from MDH, but this is just for meningococcus and Tdap. And you can see we're starting to come back from the pandemic and having everything shut down, and then those well child visits and getting teens back in, especially because I have two teenagers, and I can tell you that there aren't, right? Like when they were babies, they had those well child visits that were scheduled. When they're teenagers, I feel like I actually have to call up. I have had to call up and say, I'm bringing them in for their HPV vaccines. And I work in this field. So I'm like, well, I wonder what's going on with everyone else and whether they're even thinking about this, and they're probably not, right? But you can see these are the two vaccines that we were doing well with. And so not up to date is still high for those. And there's no data that is presented for HPV vaccination. So I hope MDH actually updates that. So all to say, yes, we have everything we need to eliminate HPV related cancers, especially cervical cancer, but a lot of work to do in this arena. And then I think the other thing that I will mention kind of as an aside is, that COVID-19 really, it really polarized the discussion around vaccines. And so what the impact has been on HPV vaccination in particular, which was our other politicized vaccine, I think remains to be seen. Okay, last but not least, what I wanted to do was just wrap up quickly by talking about what is going to happen in the era of HPV vaccines. So we push on this, right? We push on screening, we get vaccination rates up to that 80%. What will happen? So this is work I did clearly a long time ago as a grad student. The bottom line is, once you have a very low incidence of disease, you don't need to be screening as frequently. So you need to start considering how to change your screening interval and when you can actually begin to screen that first time, because your disease burden is low. But the other component of that, and why you need to think about that, is, if you recall when I talked about that risk thing with all the different colors to stratify women and to say, what do we do with them? There are 2 points to that calculation. One of that is how much disease is in that population, and the other thing is how well does that test perform. So what's going to happen when you have very little disease in your population is, when you use that test, even if it's exactly the same test, you're going to have many, many more false positives than you are women who have a positive test result and actual disease that needs to be treated. So this is just a schematic here, but what I did is I said, okay, what if we have about the prevalence of CIN2, which it was in most populations, like in the US, is about 5%. So for any population, so right, we go in and we screen in any given year the US population of women, and that's about 5% that have disease that needs to be detected and treated. Here is your positive predictive value. That means of those who have an abnormal test result, what proportion will have actual disease that needs to be treated? And here you'll see it's about a third. Look what happens though if I change that to 0.005. So decrease it by, right, tenfold, which is kind of, we're talking about a vaccine that will remove 90% of cancers and an even greater proportion of precancers. Look at what happens to that positive predictive value. Falls off the roof, right? And so here is why I'm showing you this. I'm showing you this because the consideration for all these recommendation bodies is, right, it's that balance of benefits to harms with screening. And here's the other thing that has been speculated, and we're beginning to see this, is that 16 and 18, because they're uniquely carcinogenic, there's been this whole debate around when you look at a pap smear, those abnormalities that you see with those cells that are infected, some of that comes from the fact that they are infected with 16 and 18, and they're a unique characteristic so that when you look at that pap smear, that's what you're seeing is those abnormalities, and the 16 and 18 infections are what are contributing to that. And so what this slide is showing you and why these circles are here is to say that once you remove 16 and 18, are we going to start seeing, right, fewer and fewer pap smears that have those salient characteristics that would allow people in the lab to say, these are abnormal pap smears. And in fact, that's what we're beginning to see. This is from Scotland. What they're seeing is, right, significant reduction in the positive predictive value of cytology. And you can see 2016, they had high uptake for their vaccine and sustained coverage. So they are seeing an early signal of what we anticipate we will be seeing. They are also beginning to see a reduction in their test performance for HPV testing, right? So predicted impact of HPV vaccine. So people kept saying, well, this is only going to affect pap smears. And what we're saying is, no, this is going to impact all our tests. We think it will impact how HPV tests will perform and how cytology tests will perform. And here is the thing, right? This is the reduction in disease. Look at this with the 9-valent vaccine, which is the one that all our kids are getting now. And so what I want to end on is this whole thought about how will we screen women in the age of cervical cancer, these HPV vaccines? Well, to the point where what I should point out is there have been no changes in the recommendations for girls who are vaccinated. They get screened exactly the same way as girls who were not vaccinated. And if you're thinking, well, that makes no sense given what you have shown, I say absolutely. There's been pushback though, right? And they keep saying, well, we don't know if they were vaccinated. We don't know what their actual risk is, which all speaks to how we keep records, right? Having that record keeping and being able to say, no, that they've been vaccinated. They have their, number of shots, because this is what we're looking at. If you remember when we were weighing those benefits and harms, right? You want to optimize benefits compared to harms. But what we're dealing with now going forward is a very different set of scenarios where for these girls who have been vaccinated, and now we have a larger and larger segment of our population of girls that fit the bill, continuing to screen that group the same way that we are screening girls who are not vaccinated makes no sense. We have more harms because what's going to happen is more false positives and more unnecessary procedures compared to if we step off. What does step off mean though? So right now, modeling that's been done by the group that I'm part of, by our group, is that maybe we screen them every 10 years. And maybe we screen them just a few times in their lifetime. So a sea change is coming with our screening. And what I should say is Australia is looking at elimination soon. And they are already having these discussions about how do we change our screening. So that's it. Thank you for listening to me, and any questions?
I've got a microphone if you've got a question. Hang on, I've got one online. So I have a question from Clement Wilcox. In outreach for HPV vaccine in minorities, can you speak about how these populations are being, it says riched, I'm not sure what the word is supposed to be, RICHED.
Or reached?
Reached, maybe how these populations are being reached.
Sure. So there are a number of programs within Minnesota and across the country to tailor the education and outreach for different groups. And so I know that a few years back, thank you. A few years back, what MDH did was, so MDH has, and many states have this, is they have data which they collect on vaccinations for children. That is entered into our state database. It's called MIC. And what they did was they actually went through MIC and they analyzed the data to say how many children were up to date in their vaccines, how many were not, which vaccines were they missing. And then what they did was they sent tailored letters in different languages out to the community to say, you know, your child is missing these vaccines. This is where they can get these vaccines. But here are, you know, if you're lacking insurance, here is how you might address that. So there were tailored efforts underway within Minnesota to actually do that outreach. And we also have a program, I think, called Vaccines for Children, which gives free vaccines to kids. So there are a number of different ways that the outreach was being done. And what we were seeing is, in fact, highly successful in getting kids vaccinated. And then the pandemic, I feel like everything was, you know, like everything was good before the pandemic. Yep. So my hope is that we can go back to actually focusing on some of those outreach programs that we had that were tailored. Yep. I think there's a.
Oh, hang on, I've got a question at the back.
So I guess my question is, what do you envision as the outcome for recommendations when, frankly, we may unfortunately fail in our vaccination efforts? I think COVID has proven that if something like this gets politicized, there's going to be a significant faction of patients who ultimately will never be vaccinated. So now you have a problem of, as you mentioned, there's a patient population where screening makes no sense anymore. You'll be doing more harm, you'll be doing more colposcopies, et cetera. But then you have a patient population who hasn't ever been vaccinated. So now you have this very complicated mixture of patients already in a very complicated, fast changing world. As a clinician myself, I can tell you that the changes over the last several years have been very frustrating for someone who doesn't even practice in this field and make recommendations. So now you have a very complex field that's getting only more complex.
I absolutely agree with you. There has been a lot of pushback on, like, every other year there seem to be new recommendations. I will say, if we were to step back, we have theoretically three different groups: a group that's never been vaccinated, a group that was vaccinated with a quadrivalent vaccine, right? So only 16 and 18, 70% of cancers. And now we have a group that has been vaccinated with a non-valent vaccine. And so the considerations for those three groups are different. And I think we are going to be looking at, we have to think now, how do we tailor recommendations to balance that, balance those benefit and harms given these groups? And it's a complicated picture. And to your point, you're absolutely right. I think that there will be people who will never be vaccinated in our country, and we have to take that into consideration. But I think the big thing is, how do we, for me, it's really thinking through who has that data and who, when you're a clinician, what do you know is their history when they come in through the door, so you know the right recommendations to kind of access. And that I get very frustrated with that, especially when I look at Europe, where I'm like, you have everyone's information, right? So I hear you on that, and I think we have a complicated picture going forward.
Shalini, I just want to say thank you so much for your excellent presentation. A lot to think about in there. That's going to be a new era of screening recommendations coming. So be very interesting to see how we grapple with that. So again, thank you for being here. One more round of thanks. We appreciate your time.